From WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Kate Young, and this is Earth Eats.
Throughout industrial history, the idea behind weeds is very political and it's very constructed. They are only weeds because they get in the way of ideas of how you think that a well-kept, clean, pristine area would look, or like you're trying to reach a certain idea of class.
This week, on the third summer episode of our Eats Wild series, we harvest and cook Quelites, or wild greens, with anthropologist Keitlyn Alcantara. And we talk about Indigenous foodways and how to think differently about gardens and weeds. Plus, we learn how to make simple floral syrups from linden and elderflowers. That's all just ahead. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to Eats Wild, our special series on Earth Eats, all about foraging for wild food. Throughout this series, we've been talking about foraging almost like a hobby. Our contemporary foodways have separated us from noticing and accessing the food that grows all around us. It's more familiar for us to buy food from the grocery store or to eat at a restaurant or maybe to harvest from our own cultivated gardens. But the people who inhabited this land before the colonizers arrived, and for many Indigenous people today, gathering food from the environment is a common, everyday practice. It's not wild food, it's simply food. A couple of years ago, I had IU anthropology professor Keitlyn Alcantara on the show, and it remains one of my favorite conversations. Keitlyn is an anthropological bioarchaeologist who studies Indigenous foodways of the past and present. I thought she would be a great person to talk with about foraging for wild food. I met up with Keitlyn Alcantara at Hilltop Garden and Nature Center in August of 2024.
Hilltop Garden and Nature Center is a larger space that was established in the 40s by a biology teacher to create experiential learning spaces for students at IU. I started a garden here in 2021, and our space in the Healing Garden, which is a subset of Hilltop, is intended to help people reconnect with the land that they're living on and kind of pay attention to the details of what's growing here and get to know both the land itself, its history, and their relationship to it.
Great. All right. Well, let's head out to the garden.
Okay.
It was peak summertime as we stepped out of Hilltop's main building and out into the gardens.
The whole rest of this is all Hilltop Garden. We're within Hilltop Garden, and there's a lot of different projects at Hilltop. Okay. So there's a dye garden over there, there's a flower garden, there's a tea garden, there's a shade garden, there's beekeepers club, and so all of these different things all of these different people are using this space for different projects, and ours is really focused on having people really just like get into the plants and learn a little bit about what is native here in Indiana, what they might see in other places in Indiana when they're wandering in a forest, and just kind of get to know to recognize food.
We were looking for something in particular.
This is our vast field here. I'm gonna look for some with bigger leaves because the stems aren't awesome for cooking, but the leaves cook down really nicely.
Around here, it's often called lamb's quarters. Much of Keitlyn's research has taken place in Mexico. We thought it would be nice to harvest some edible plants that are easily found in Mexico and here in Indiana in the Healing Garden. Plants that many people think of as weeds.
Again, these are like the Indiana version, and in Mexico the leaves are a lot bigger, so they're more like a spinach or something like that where you get a lot from the plant. But what tends to happen the more further north you go is that the part of the plant that's beneficial to humans, like the things that you would eat, are smaller. So that the plant is putting more energy into its stem, into its roots, so that it can survive the hardier weather. I'm going to take some squash flowers, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
I think they would be really good in what we're going to make.
Quelites is a term that loosely refers to wild greens, often including lamb's quarters called Quelites cenizo, purslane, verdolaga, and also sometimes squash blossoms, which are cultivated, but they're often included in the overarching category of Quelites. I'm happy to see Keitlyn gather them because they are one of my favorite flavors. We spent time walking around the healing garden. Keitlyn and A.B. Scherschel, the garden manager, pointed out so many interesting plants. Some I was familiar with, others not. And we talked about how the maintenance and tending practices of a community garden space evolve over time as our expectations meet up with reality. The healing garden definitely had a wild feel to it, especially compared to some of the other tidy hilltop spaces. But it's evident that the garden is cared for. Plants are placed with intention, and there's a sense of discovery as you wander the paths. The unpredictability is delightful. After exploring the healing garden and gathering the Quelites, we headed over to the radio TV building, also on the IU campus, to cook in our staff break room.
There's all kinds of ways to use these wild greens, and it's just like how anybody would use spinach in a million different ways or chard in a million different ways. So it's not a set recipe.
Yeah, and they're mild, they're tender, they're not bitter or anything.
No, they're not bitter. They're pretty mild. Just when you saute them, they just get a lot softer and absorb flavors really well. So a lot of times people will add them to soups.
So right now you have the lamb's quarters, which is also called
Quelites. Well, it's a kind of quelite. Quelite is like a general category of wild greens that are like managed, so they're not considered weeds because you have a relationship to them that's positive.
And then the purslane.
The purslane is called verdolaga.
Keitlyn also chopped up the squash blossoms from the healing garden, and I had brought garlic, onion, and hot chili peppers from my own garden. Keitlyn sauteed the wild greens and the aromatics in a skillet with some olive oil.
I think I'm going to do this one with just garlic and onions, and then the other one, I'm going to do this together. And I think that'll work well for two different flavors. I love how it gets so green once you start to cook it. It just feels full of life.
Yeah, it's really bright. Then it was time for the quesadilla.
It's just the tortillas on the pan getting warm because it makes it more flexible. And then I stringed up some cheese to put in the middle and put a little bit of the greens inside.
Can you say anything about the cheese?
It's queso Oaxaca, so it's a kind of string cheese that is used mostly for quesadillas, but it comes from a southern state in Mexico. It's a pretty standard cheese that you can get anywhere, and it's like a melting cheese.
Well, you might be able to get queso Oaxaca anywhere in Mexico, but here in Bloomington, Indiana, I found it at La Bonita Market on North College Avenue. Once the cheese was melted, she scrambled a couple of eggs, folded in some of the Quelites, while the others went into the quesadillas. We warmed up a few more tortillas for egg tacos, and then it was time to taste. A.B. joined us for this part. Everything looked and smelled fabulous.
Okay.
All right, so what have we got here?
So this is the one that is Quelites, just the garlic, onion, and the lamb's quarters. And then this is the one that has the squash flower, the verdolagas, the onion, the spice. And then these ones over here are with egg.
Great, and they all have cheese.
They all have cheese.
All right, let's taste.
I'm going to start spicy.
I'm going to start with just the lamb's quarters.
I bet this would make a good pesto too.
Oh, yeah. All of these greens.
Oh, I really like the lamb's quarter. It's spinachy, but it's got that little bit of wildness.
It feels like just soft and gentle green to me.
Yeah, it's really good. I love all the flavors.
And it's really easy. Like, I think people don't know what to do with wild greens or how to incorporate them. But you don't have to do much with this one to fold it in. And so the history of wild greens is really closely tied to kind of communities that are in resistance and dealing with things that are really difficult, lack of access to other types of food. But I think the fact that it's really easy feeds into that history as well, where like maybe you're exhausted because you're trying to fight all these other systemic issues, and then you can just make this really delicious soup just by going out and grabbing this handful of these wild greens and then popping them in a pot with some onion and like blending it all up, and all of a sudden you have energy and nutrition to be able to keep going. And yeah, so I think about them also and supporting in that way, and like being this plant that's there for moments that are really difficult.
That was Keitlyn Alcantara, cooking up a quick and lovely meal featuring Quelites, wild greens gathered in the healing garden at Hilltop Garden and Nature Center. After the break, we'll step into the studio with Keitlyn for a longer conversation about wild food. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Kate Young. This is Earth Eats Wild. We're in the studio now with Keitlyn Alcantara, and I asked her to start by telling us a bit about her work here at Indiana University.
I'm in Bloomington as a professor in anthropology, and I think that is one element of what I do and why I'm interested in plants. My research there is focused on how food systems from before colonization continue on in the present and how there's spaces of resistance for different communities, and specifically in Mexico. But then I also see how that happens in immigrant communities or in Indigenous communities, Native communities in the U.S. There's all these pockets of spaces where people are living like kind of parallel worlds to the dominant one. And they do that a lot through food, a lot through the way they relate to their environment and to their surroundings. So that's generally what I'm interested in. And then I'm also really interested in how we learn about these things in non-academic environments. So listening to elders, watching kids, watching plants themselves, listening to people who have been minoritized within these larger institutions. So I teach a community-based research class where we kind of think through who do we listen to and why, and how can we be better at having more open ears, and also like challenging our own ideas of what we count as information, what we count as knowledge, what we count as data. And then some other classes that I teach are kind of about these food histories of how our current food system came to be, and trying to expose the way that laws and political decisions came into play to create the food system that we think is so normal now, but that has only existed for a little bit of time, and that we could start to imagine futures that are quite different from it and see models that are quite different from it in other places. So those are kind of like the research areas I'm focused on. And then personally, I am a very earth person. I love to play in the dirt. I love to be out in nature. And I think for me, academic space has been hard in the past because of how lab-centered, how classroom-centered it is. So inadvertently, I've started to do a lot of classes in the garden, create a lot of spaces for art in higher education, and just trying to like balance those ways of knowing the world. And yeah, just kind of getting to know different students' perspectives instead of kind of like the top-down, we're going to teach you this way of being. It's like, well, I'm going to give you some information. How do you interpret it? What kind of background helps you interpret it in the way that makes most sense to you, and why? And yeah, so that's a little bit about what I'm doing here.
Shortly after arriving in Bloomington, Keitlyn started the Healing Garden at Hilltop Garden and Nature Center, which she talked about earlier in the show. We talked about how they manage the garden.
It depends a lot on who is there. I think when we first started the garden, I had more of a strict idea of this is how this is going to look, but maintaining it in a way that is the standard for humans of what it should look like needs other people there. And sometimes you have them and sometimes you don't. And that doesn't mean people aren't enjoying the garden, that people aren't participating, but it was a huge lesson in letting go of control of not just the plants, but of people. People get stressed during the semester and they may want to do things, but then they can't. And nothing changes in the long, long run if we get this done this month or next month.
That's been my experience with community gardens. Sometimes you have the time to tend to them, to keep the weeds under control, and sometimes you don't. And we talked about rethinking what a weed even is.
Throughout industrial history, the idea behind weeds is very political and it's very constructed. They are only weeds because they get in the way of ideas of how you think that a well-kept, clean, pristine area would look, or like you're trying to reach a certain idea of class. And it's like a lot to do with this kind of plant blindness, this ability to see things for their value versus this perspective on weeds and plants as something that you have to control, you have to destroy, you have to like manage. You can't see it because you don't know it, you don't know its name. And I think that that's a really important part in this history of foraging and this history of like why we think things are weeds is because we've lost sight of them and we don't know who they are and what they're doing. And so we just like kind of throw them into this pile of things that don't matter, things that aren't doing anything important, things that are just kind of trash and need to be managed, instead of understanding them as kind of collaborators and things that could actually help keep our lawns from drying out in the summer if we know what is good for protecting the subsoil. And they can do so many things.
And what about plants that are edible and that are really, not just doing things for the environment or for the soil or whatever, but things that people could be eating? And do you know of any like restrictions around gathering food?
Not restrictions necessarily, but something that we're currently trying to have a conversation around at Hilltop is the use of Roundup on campus plants. And I think that the idea behind pesticides and kind of controlling weeds that is so normalized, it's like this battle tactic, right? You want to eliminate everything without understanding how they're interrelated. And so while you're eliminating something that you consider useless, you're also making it so another kind of plant that is edible is no longer accessible to people. Or like certain plants that grow kind of in succession where one will need the shade of the other to be able to come up. And so even though it's not directly like a law saying you can't forage, you can't do this, it's indirectly creating context where it's going to be harder for you to turn this lawn into something that you could eat from.
Right.
And I think that that's part of like the politics behind it is how do we make these spaces that can only be used in a particular way?
Yeah.
Instead of allowing them to be creative spaces that people could decide to use in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
And something that's kind of just hidden within those laws.
Yeah, and I feel like because we've gotten with the industrialized food system and people being more disconnected from the land, I find that in a foraging practice, sometimes when you're introducing people to plants that they can eat, there's this hesitancy of like, can I just pick this and eat it? Like, is that okay? And I feel like it's just part of that separation of like, you've got to buy it in a package at the store with a price tag on it. And that's how you know it's safe to eat.
Yeah. A lot of what I'm thinking through right now is how the experiences that I've had working with farmers in Mexico influence the way that I am deciding to exist in the U.S. when I come back to the U.S. And one of the things that appears again and again and again in the literature about campesino farmers, about like peasant small-scale farmers in Mexico, is how their food systems aren't just a moment in their day. It's their entire day. It's how you decide to make breakfast, how you decide to go on a walk to go visit the plants that you know, or you go walk over to your neighbors and on the way there's an apple tree that you know that you pick from in this month of the year. And so it's like, I think a lot of times when we teach people about foraging, again, it becomes a hobby, but it doesn't actually change the structure of how they're living every day. And I think for foraging and for kind of communal sustainable food systems, it's not just about when you sit down to eat or when you grab the thing and put it in your mouth. It's like, how are you building relationships that will allow you to have space when you're not stressed, when you're not tired, where you have enough energy to get to know these plants and notice them in your day-to-day? Do you have enough energy to go on a walk and be like, oh, it looks like the elderberries are blooming? Like, I know you by your house you have some elderberries because I would go and see them when they bloomed and see them when they had berries and like making those spaces available so that you're actually changing the way that you're engaging in these systems. which is a lot harder than just going to a foraging class and learning how to identify the things. It's like, how do you weave them into your life as well?
Yeah, so it's not just I go mushroom hunting in chanterelle season and the rest of the year I'm just like inside or going to the grocery store or whatever, but like if it's more a part of how you live and how you move through the world and notice what's in the world around you.
Yeah.
In your place.
And like, for example, the chanterelles, like, how are you making sure that the places that they're showing up are being cared for the rest of the year? So it's not just like when it's useful to you and it's productive to you, you go and you take this thing, but how are you investing energy into these spaces so that throughout the year, throughout time, you're caring for the place that you're living in, not just taking from it. And I think that relates to food, but it also relates to like your community and making sure that you're more conscious of the energy people are putting in and how to keep that balanced both in other than human beings and in the human beings that are in your life.
I think when I first started foraging, especially like fruit, I would be like, oh, there's all these birds. They're going to get all the fruit or whatever. And then I realized pretty quickly, like, the birds are going to get some. And we're going to get some. And other people are going to get some. And, and some bugs are going to get some. And, like, there's plenty, It's like like with the elderberries, there's so many that, there's enough for everybody. And it feels good to be feeding the birds with those, but then also to be able to like go and take a few and use them.
Yeah, and I think it's like a mindset shift because the way that the industrial food system works is that you're trying to quantify so that you can make money off of something. Like if you are able to get all of it, like how much return are you going to get? And with more of like a foraging kind of reciprocal relationship, it's not going to be money that you get back. It's going to be other things that are not quantifiable. And it doesn't matter if you get all of it or some of it, how you distribute it, how you invest your energy, how you like return the energy, whether it's going and getting some of those apples and then using the ones that are all picked by the birds to make an apple pie that you give to a friend. And now all of a sudden that like it's not a direct apple money exchange, but you're building relationships. And so there's a lot more complexity in kind of the economics of foraging and of kind of gathering rather than just like looking at everything as a product.
Yeah. Or thinking about like yield or something, it is definitely a different kind of mindset. But I do think when it does become part of your life and you're noticing the same plants year after year, then you start to notice things about this season versus last season and like how the plant changed or how much production there was this year versus last year. So there's lots of different ways that you can connect with your place just by observing plants year round.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you want to talk more about, like, for instance, the plant that one of the main plants we were cooking with today, and places that you've encountered it before and ways you've seen it used or talked about?
Yeah, there is a lot written, but most of it in Spanish, about the history of Quelites in Mexico and Mesoamerica. I've been writing a chapter on it, so I've gotten really deep into that literature. But I remember coming to Bloomington and seeing them on the beeline and also seeing them in the garden. And we actually did a post on our Instagram about them because there was another student from Nepal who also recognized them. And so we kind of compared our experiences and familiarity with Quelites. But like in markets in Mexico, you'll see them in the market all like gathered in a bunch and sold by the bunch, like you would get spinach. And yeah, they're kind of just added in everywhere. And looking at the history of them, they have been a part of human plant interactions since agriculture started in Mesoamerica. And like I was telling you, I think in the garden, they are kind of this plant that fills a gap in the growing season where they tend to be available when the main crop is still growing, and that farmers will manage them. So they'll choose which ones to let get bigger and when to gather them so that they don't end up overtaking the garden, but they also don't get rid of them because they're so generous that they can be used at multiple different times. So you want to keep them around. And then like another thing that I really like about these wild greens is genetically they're really diverse because they're constantly changing. They like one of the characteristics of things that are considered weeds is that they have a lot of seeds and they reproduce really quickly. And so their genetics are constantly changing each generation, so they can adapt to things really quickly. Where like a crop, like if you think of corn, like you get one round of it a year. And so it's going to take a whole other year for it to adapt. And that year might look really different. And so it takes it longer to be able to adapt to things like drought or heavy rains or hail or whatever climate crisis is coming up. But these
or soil conditions or
Yeah, but these wild plants, they're just really adept at changing to things really quickly. And so even when you lose your crop, you're probably going to have some of these wild plants around to fill in those gaps. So they're just like really cool. They're really just efficient, generous. And then like because they are dealing with soils that are maybe more compacted or have they're lacking in nutrients, they end up creating a lot of nutrients themselves. And so they're also really nutrient dense in comparison to some of the crops that we grow that are domesticated.
So what do you mean by creating nutrients? Like how?
I'm not like at the chemistry level. I'm going to give you my like anthropology understanding of it. But when they process things from the soils, they're able within their bodies to transform what they're getting from the soils into like chemically alter into what they need to turn light into food. And so, for example, like dandelions are often found in places that have very poor nutrient soils because they're able to dig really deep into the soil with their taproots and pull out anything that they need and then like generate within their own bodies other elements that they might need. And when they do that, they're making it more bioavailable to other plants that will come after them.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So they're actually making the soil better.
Yeah, and that's usually what most things that are considered weeds are doing. And that's why it's also really cool to get to know what are some of the weeds in your area, because they'll tell you what your soil, what kind of like relationship is going on in that moment in your soil, and like what your soil might need to be able to be ready for a crop that is going to take more than it's going to give. Like they're these just very reciprocal plants. They're not just stripping the soil of nutrients. They're actively creating like a dynamic where they're creating balance.
Wow. I'm going to really think twice before I try to dig up the entire root of a dandelion again.
Yeah. And I mean, like, again, that idea of balance is dandelions, they do take up space and they reproduce really fast. And you'll get like this whole field of dandelions that are going to choke out other things that you're trying to plant. So again, like they can be doing their job and also you can give them kind of boundaries and say that, thank you, but that's enough. That was enough of that job. And now I'm going to plant something else here.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about this plant or about things that you've noticed about foraging in Mexico and foraging here?
Well, one of the things that I have really loved seeing is there's codices that were written by Spanish friars that were kind of working with Indigenous communities in like the mid-1500s, right after they arrived in Mesoamerica and Mexico. And their perspective on colonization was kind of in contrast to the military, who was very like violent colonization of, you know, we're going to burn down your houses and kick you off your land. And the church, I think there's like a history too of people from monasteries being really big planters. And I think that might be something that was happening, is that they were noticing that people had a lot of plant knowledge. And so as a way to kind of surreptitiously colonize, they were like, tell us about it. And they wrote down all of these compendiums of what people knew about plants and insects and animals as a way to kind of undermine them and then use that information against them. But now it serves as a record, and the documents are really cool. Most of them are free online. You can look them up, but they'll have these images, and the plant that we gathered, you can see it in these codices from the 1500s drawn of how people would gather it. They have like all kinds of different insects too. And so it's just really cool to see the ecological knowledge that existed then. And then working with people in the present, you can see not a direct line, but you can see how that knowledge has been passed down through people who are interested in that lens of the world and are still paying attention to those things at the same time as like the more central government state is turning towards more industrialized relationships to lands and plants and stuff. But I don't know. I just see it as like the plant nerds showing up throughout generations and just being really curious about how many different kinds of grasshoppers are there and what's the difference between these different kinds of bees, and like look at how this kind of wild green grows here and has this kind of seeds, and this one grows in this time, and this one's better for soup, but this one's better for tamales, and like all of this knowledge that is not just about food, but it's about paying attention to the environment you're living in and being curious and being interested in helping keep that balance in the environment that you engage with every day.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting to hear about those records that are kept, because I would imagine it's pretty hard to otherwise to kind of research what did people do. Well, I know that that's a big part of what you do is you research what people ate. But when there aren't a whole lot of records.
Their own perspective of like, because I know I can look at more of like the molecular compounds of what people ate, but I don't know how they ate it, and right. I don't know how they grew it, and I don't know what their relationship to the plant was. I just know that it existed in their bodies. So right. This is that whole anthropological kind of cultural part that is really interesting to see.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. One thing I was going to ask when you were talking about the lamb's quarters and how people use it between seasons, and that you would see it at a farmer's market. Do people cultivate it? Like, are people trying to, get bigger leaves or do anything like that? Or is it mostly just like it's harvested as is?
I think unintentionally cultivated. Like, from my conversations and experiences with people, no one has been like, we are trying to get, these leaves bigger, but they do choose the ones that have bigger leaves. And so then they'll have the seeds from those and plant them again. And that's kind of how, domestication happened in the history of humanity. So I think it's similar to that, but also like, I think the fact that it isn't so strict where they're trying to kind of wipe out the ones that are smaller means that diversity stays there. So if there's something that humans think is great, but that the plant is like, but this isn't really helpful for, years when we have a lot of fires, then the plant still has that genetic diversity within its lineage, and maybe the offspring that end up adapting better to that change are the ones that are going to survive, not the ones that the humans chose. And so it's not quite as rigid as, planting a crop. But there's a relationship, and there's choice, and there's decisions that are being made as to which ones to pick. But yeah, it's different. One of the things that is interesting about plants in the context of Mexico that is probably also true here, though I know a lot less about the history of Indiana, but when humans have gone through moments of intense change, stress, loss of big parts of the population, the plants will kind of hold memory of how to interact with them. And they can reteach you when there's like for example, these wild greens, right? I didn't grow up with them. Like, I didn't grow up with recipes from my great-great-great-great-grandmother or anything, but I'm able to go and observe them and learn how to gather them, learn how to cook them, in part from recipes that, I look for, but also like you can pay attention to the flavor of the plant. You can pay attention to when it grows more, and you start to learn from the plant by just observing it. So even if those lineages of knowledge passed on between humans are broken, these plants can be a space of relearning whether or not you have that lineage of people. And so I see that a lot in Mexico, in places where people will rediscover a plant in their farming area and become curious about it and relearn how to cultivate it and not have that history in their family. But yeah, just by paying attention and kind of listening to the way the plant behaves and where it thrives, where it doesn't, you start to communicate with it and learn about it.
Wow. Oh, that's really cool. Well, thank you very much. I so much appreciate you spending this time with me out picking and in the kitchen and here in the studio talking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to do it. It's always fun.
Okay, great.
That was Keitlyn Alcantara, anthropology professor at Indiana University. You can find links to her work and to a conversation with her on Earth Eats from 2022 on our website, eartheats.org. Coming up after the break, I ask a couple of neighbors of mine to teach me about making floral syrups from linden and elderflower. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Earth Eats, Eats Wild. I'm Kate Young. When we think of flowering trees, we often picture spring blossoms on fruit trees. But many trees are flowering later in the summer, and in the case of the linden tree, the blossoms are what we're interested in. In a previous episode of Eats Wild, Chef Alan Burgo, the forager chef, remarked that you can make a syrup out of almost anything, which might be true, but most often I've heard of folks making syrup from flowers. It's your best hope for attempting to capture the distinctive fragrance of a blossom into something you can taste. Today we're exploring the flavors of 2 summer flowers. We're starting with linden. I asked my neighbor, Amy Roche, to show me the ropes. I happen to have 2 linden trees on my block, and their lower branches are within reach. Amy met me at my house, and we headed for the trees with a large bowl and my squeaky snips.
It's best to harvest these aromatic flowers when it's clear and dry out and they're in full sun, just giving off their volatile aromatic oils. They have kind of a, kind of a heart-shaped leaf that's fairly deep green with lighter colored veins in it, pointed.
Yep, and they've got kind of a sawtooth edge.
Sawtooth edge, a small little sawtooth edge there. Mm-hmm. And it's asymmetrical. So one of the sort of heart lobes is higher than the other.
Yeah. Okay, I see that. Yeah. Okay.
And then another thing that I think is really distinct is that there's this other leaflet that comes out that the flower cluster grows off of.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. Okay.
Finger-like.
Yeah, it almost looks like it could be a pod or something till you get close up to it and then you see it's
sort
just
of
a little
pod-shaped.
leaf. Yeah.
Yes. So maybe it would be helpful to sort of define what a flower in its prime and past its prime is. That might be nice to say.
What do they look like?
For any flower, it's like it's before it's looking wilted, it's getting browned, tinged brown, and looking smaller. These are sort of I would call it a buttercream yellow color, and they're a little bit firm. And the ones past their prime look dried out.
Yeah, and darker.
Much darker, yeah. But there are also some that are still buds that won't be ideal either.
Okay.
You want to get them open as much as you can.
Okay. Once we'd gathered a bowl full of blossoms, we went inside to start the syrup.
You should pick them when you're ready to prepare them, when you're ready to process it right away, because once you pick them, they're going to be starting to wilt and break down.
So you don't want them in the fridge or anything like that. Just pick them right before you're going to do it.
Yeah, they'll totally wilt in the refrigerator. I have experienced.
Okay.
Some people say you should rinse them off, and some people just say shake them, and I think you should do what your preference is, but you definitely want to shake out insects that are living in there and spiders and such.
Yeah, I hesitate to rinse something like this because I feel like what we want is that essence, and it's kind of delicate, and you don't want it to go away.
And it's probably in the pollen and in the nectar that could be rinsed off, right?
Yeah.
Thankfully, it's not a complicated thing. Starting with simple syrup, which is equal parts water and sugar, brought to a boil until the sugar dissolves into the water. That's called a simple syrup.
That's really great to know, too, that it's such a simple ratio, because you then can just adjust to however many flowers you happen to get.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so do you separate each blossom from the stem?
So some people will cut at least the leaflet that we talked about that they're growing off of, just that. I like to go a little closer to the flowers and snip just below the base of the flower. It's just, for me, a matter of getting as much of the stem matter off as possible, because stem usually is more bitter.
Okay. So should we be mixing up the syrup now? While you're doing that, I could get the syrup mixed up?
Prep the flowers.
Okay, great. Okay, so I've got 1 cup of water,
1 cup of sugar, and I'm just going to put that on the stove. And
Bring it to a boil and stir it. Make sure the sugar is dissolved, and then take it off the heat. I like to let the syrup cool a bit.
And so are there any other ingredients? You said sometimes you've put honey in, but also do you do lemon or citric acid or anything?
You can use both. Lemon, obviously, is going to impart a lemony aroma, which I think harmonizes really nicely with linden, both linden and elderflower. Mm-hmm. But it also adds acidity, which is a preserving factor. So you've got the sugar preserving, but also acid, and the combination makes it last longer. Citric acid, even more so. I brought citric acid today, which, by the way, you can find at local shop Goods for Cooks if you're looking for it. Would you like lemon in your recipe this time?
I want to try the citric acid.
Okay.
So how much do you think you'd put in there? Just a quarter teaspoon or something?
Not even. A very small pinch, especially for the size that we're doing. It's very acidic. You really don't need much.
Okay. And do you put that into the sugar, into the simple syrup?
I'll put it in with the flowers at the same time.
Okay. Okay, so what kind of things do you use the syrup for? How do you enjoy it?
One of my favorite ways to consume floral syrups is in my homemade seltzer water, mineral water, especially in the hot summer. I'm doing a lot of garden consulting work, working outside in the heat. I want a cold, refreshing soda, and this feels like a little closer to home.
I also understand you made a cordial. What is a cordial?
Cordial is the version with lemon and citric acid added, and it is historically used for mixing cocktails. Yeah. Also think the syrups are nice over ice cream, even just over fruit, like to add a layer of flavor to a fruit salad.
Or just like your breakfast bowl, if you've got yogurt and fruit and stuff going on.
Yogurt. And in espresso drinks. Yeah.
Oh, in espresso drinks,
Yeah,
a fruit. Is it good?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really good. I love it. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a lot of coffee shops will have lavender lattes or lavender breves and such. It's kind of in that vein, just a different flower. I think people should experiment and see what they like. Anytime you might put maple syrup or sugar or honey, you could try this and see what you get. It just imparts a subtle but distinct floral layer, a perfumey layer.
Cool. Wow. All right, so we ready to pour over?
So let's see. Yeah, I can stick my finger in that. Okay, here we go.
So that's it, and then we just let it sit for how long again?
So we can leave it on the counter till it's room temperature, and then put it in the refrigerator for a few hours, up to 3 days.
Then simply strain through a fine sieve, discard the flowers, and enjoy your syrup. Be sure to store it in the fridge, and it will be good for 2 to 4 weeks. A visual inspection will let you know if it's still good. Just make sure the syrup is clear with no mold forming, and give it a sniff too.
I'm Amy Roche, longtime Bloomingtonian, gardener, baker, lover of native plants, nature, and all the goodness they bring.
And a forager.
A forager, yeah. I've picked a few.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really lovely.
Thank you. It's been really fun.
I know it sounded like we were saying goodbye, but Amy stuck around for a visit from another neighbor, Julia Valiant. I invited her over to talk with us about elderflower syrup. I knew she had made it before, and we just happened to have a flowering bush just outside our back door. We stepped outside with the snips.
What are you looking for when you're harvesting this?
I'm looking for flowers that look young, basically. I hate to put it that bluntly, but I don't know, I get a little iffy when they get wrinkly and yellowed, and so when they're like plump and white and their petals are large, then I feel confidence in harvesting the flower.
All right, well, let's snip a few.
Yeah, they're so abundant.
Yeah.
It's like you can't just pick a few.
Well, let's go inside with these. We shook the flower clusters just like we did the linden, and then started removing the flowers from the stems. You want to avoid the stems as much as possible, since we aren't cooking these. The flowers are edible in their raw state, but the rest of the plant, including the stem, can be slightly toxic unless it's cooked.
Snipping at the smallest part of the stem.
So you're not individually plucking each flower off, you're just snipping them.
No, because these flowers are like the size of snowflakes. They're really small.
Really small.
So you gotta care for them together like mini snowballs.
Okay, so we're doing basically the same process. We're taking the flowers off the stem. We're going to cover them with a simple syrup. And in this case, I think I do want to add the lemon. I think it works really nice with this.
Yeah, pep it up.
While we plucked the tiny elder flowers from the lacy bunches, I asked Amy and Julia about foraging, what it means to them, why they think it's important.
It gives you a feeling of belonging and of sharing, an experience of sharing.
Yeah, and of the world caring for you.
Yeah.
Just look around and find things that you need.
Yeah.
It softens life.
Yeah, and it's like a belonging to a place, like understanding what's around you. Okay, so we've got our simple syrup, which was 1 part sugar, 1 part water. We boiled it.
Ready?
Yep.
And now come lemon wedges squeezed to draw out more elder flavor, the subtle elder flavor.
All right, so then do the same with this. Let it set.
The challenge, though, is actually using it, because it's not part of our culture. And then in the fridge, you have a bottle of flowered syrup in the summer. I feel like for recipes like this, you know, they're not integral to my food routines. And so it starts out with excitement and abundance. And I'm making the syrup, and it's a fun project, and harvesting the flowers. And then it goes into the fridge, and it's satisfaction and completion. But then if the syrup starts to turn cloudy or gets off or grows little mushrooms in it and needs to be poured out, then I feel a bit sad and confused by my elderflower enterprise in my, United Statesian food routine. So it is a puzzle, like figuring out how to bring these foods into our normal routines.
I appreciated Julia getting real with us, and I have definitely been there with some of my own wild food projects. One way to incorporate flower syrups into daily summertime routines is to mix a few teaspoons into cold or hot drinks, sparkling water, cocktails, mocktails, tea, or even coffee drinks. Thank you so much for doing this with me. It's been really fun playing with flowers and cordials in the kitchen.
It's really fun.
It's a treat. Yeah.
Thanks for having us over to do it, and I would do it again anytime.
All right. Same.
That was Amy Roche and Julia Valiant, fellow foragers, fans of trees and plants, and makers of delicious things. Flower syrups are easy and fun to make, but after making a few different ones, including one from black locust blossoms, I wasn't sure what the difference was between them. Mostly, they tasted sweet and floral. I consulted with some neutral observers, or rather colleagues from the station gathered in the staff break room, for some side-by-side tastings. Sadly, we're out of time for this episode of Eats Wild, but you can check out that taste test with some highly developed palates on our social media, at Earth Eats on Instagram and on Facebook. Thanks for listening, and look for 3 more episodes featuring foods foraged in the fall. We're talking staghorn sumac, elderberries,
bur oak acorns, and a wonderful conversation with Mel Gilman, maker of comics and zines all about wild edibles and foraging. That's all coming your way in September, so stay tuned. The Earth Eats team includes Eobon Binder, Alex Chambers, Toby Foster, Luann Johnson, Leo Pies, Samantha Shimenauer, Peyton Whaley, and we partner with Harvest Public Media. Special thanks this week to Keitlyn Alcantara, A.B. Scherschel, Amy Roche, and Julia Valiant. Earth Eats is produced and edited by me, Kate Young. Our theme music is composed by Aaron Toby and performed by Aaron and Matt Toby. Additional music on the show comes to us from Universal Production Music. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge.